Welcome to another episode of the Business Speed Podcast. I'm Steve Breitenstein here with Nick Bratton. Always excited to bring more content your way around speed training and athletic development, running a business, the struggles, successes, tears, and sweat that goes into it, and leading a team, leading a staff, leadership in general. And Nick, for you, I know that you guys are kind of building your staff still as you have a relatively new staff. And part of that we always talk about is opportunities to bond together, to grow together. And I know you were just sharing with me, just you guys are taking a huge chance and a big trip together. We're going to figure out if BSP is still a staff after this one. Can you give everybody a little insight into what the plan is for you guys?
Yeah, there's been a lot up in the air the last week or two. We talked about the winter storm that hit last week, and this was a trip that I'd kind of been looking at doing for a couple of weeks. But then when I knew that the snow was coming, it was something I kind of put on hold. And then last minute, we all kind of sat down as a staff, and I introduced it to them about 7 days ago and said, "Hey, listen, this is an opportunity to be able to travel to Atlanta to do this conference on a Saturday. But because of where we're at, it's going to be a really tight time frame. We're going to have to train right up until Friday afternoon, hop in a car, drive 6 hours together, do the conference all day on Saturday, then hop back in a car, drive home, basically take Sunday to rest, and then get back at it on Monday morning." And so not knowing how everybody was going to react, and, everybody's enthusiastic and ready to go. And so, it's not always the ideal situation. I would love to be able to go up a day or two beforehand and spend time, talking with other strength coaches and visiting and, be able to really just have good conversation. But unfortunately, those are not the circumstances. And so we have a bit of a different dynamic this weekend.
And sometimes the most special kind of results from a quick trip like that is those conversations in the car.
Yeah.
On the surface level, you say, my God, 6 hours there, 6 hours back. That is a long time to be in the car together. But at the same time, people get to really know each other, or you get to have some phenomenal discussions about what we just consumed. That's always such an important part of going to a clinic as a team and a staff is the breakdown of it. To say, Well, Nick, what did you see? What did you take away from that? Steve, what was important to you from that presentation? And to understand not only people's big takeaways, but to understand just how they consume that content in the first place. Because we all have a different lens as how we receive that information. And I'll be excited for the breakdown from that when you guys come back.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is I didn't even think about this, but for two of my staff members, this is their first conference ever, and so I was chatting with one the other day, and she was saying to me, she's like, "Yeah, I really don't know what to expect. I've never been to one of these. I had thought that you had to be certified before you could go to a conference." And so, I am trying to do some work on the front end to talk to them about, like, hey, you need to be thinking about these things going into it. Do some research on the presenters. Have an idea of, because I'm a big, and not to hijack our episode here, but I'm a big proponent for always speaking to presenters when they wrap up. Because, as a presenter myself, I know one thing that I hate is when I step off stage and no one has any questions and no one comes up and speaks to me. Because it's one of two things. Either that topic was a complete dud and everybody was just waiting for me to finish up, or somehow I explained every detail so well that no one had any questions from that. And I don't think it's the latter. And so, just trying to do some research on these presenters, know what they've done, where they've been, who they've worked with. That way, when you talk to them afterwards or at some point throughout the day on Saturday, you have something to discuss, whether it be their presentation or not. There are times where we both know, like, there are some presentations that just fall flat, and it's not necessarily the fault of the presenter. There can be a lot of things that go wrong. But if that were to happen, is there something else that you can talk to them about? Because, Steve, you and I have been doing this for 2 decades now. Yeah. There are conferences you and I go to that sometimes we struggle to find things, even though we work really hard. We struggle to find things in presentations that we can take away from it.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't mean it's a bad presentation. It just means that maybe we've heard the content, maybe there's trouble applying it to what we're doing. And so, with that said, there are just going to be times where we've got to work a little bit harder to take something away. And sometimes the biggest thing you take away from one of those events is the networking aspect of it.
Yeah.
And again, to properly and efficiently network, you need to know a little bit of something instead of walking up to somebody who has been in the industry for 5 decades and say, "Hey, what's your name? Good to meet you." Like,
Yeah.
you should probably do a little more work. Don't waste their time.
Yeah. No, I think that that's such a good message to kind of share with your team. And similarly, over the years, I would kind of encourage my staff to just go up and say thank you for presenting at the very
Yeah.
minimum. It means a lot to the presenter when you can just say thank you, or I really enjoyed your energy. Man, that was a fun experience. Just kind of hearing you share that. Like, even stuff like that, as simple as it can be without being specific, man, it means the world to a presenter. And no
Mm-hmm.
matter how confident they appear on stage, it still is great to be appreciated by the audience that you're sharing it with. And
Absolutely.
the second challenge, like you said about networking, is it's really tempting, and you see this all the time, is that a staff that is from a university, a staff from a private facility, they go to a conference and they all sit in the corner together and
Mm-hmm.
they consume every presentation, they have lunch together, and then they go home and travel together. And kind of the push that I would make is to say, let's not sit together for these presentations. Sit anywhere you want. Whoever is next to you on either side, ask them their name, where they're from, get their information, get their social media. And then together now, we've now contacted, if there's 4 of us, every presentation, that's 8 different people that we're interacting with. 4 presentations, we could have just interacted with 32 new people that we can bring together. And that is
Yeah.
such an easy, quick way to start building out some of these relationships and this network that we're hoping to develop always. And so just like really simple ideas going into an event like that to make sure we're maximizing the engagement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
So,
and
with
I
that
know one of the
said,
topics with one of the topics that we see at clinics, is like, we as speed coaches, we always dive into what are they going to talk about speed development. So many
yeah.
get tossed in with strength development, and we're like, yes, we love that, but there's always that ear for, is somebody talking about an aspect of speed? And Nick, you were sharing with me before we jumped on the call that you've been having some recent conversations, and hopefully maybe they touch on this in Atlanta. But what was kind of that topic that was coming up between you and some coaches?
Yeah, so ironically, in our last episode, we talked a lot about the frequency of speed training, and I had a lot of conversations over this past week about that topic in particular, whether it's because of the episode or it's just other random conversations. But one of the conversations I found myself in was with another coach who we were talking about the importance of max velocity training in season and how you design that. Because I do think that there is a bit of a fallacy of, we get to the season and we don't need to do any speed training
Yeah.
anymore. Whether it's for health concerns or whether it's because they believe that you get enough of it in sport. We will do, and I design max velocity training all the way up until the midway point in the season. And there are several reasons for this. One, and I could be wrong, this is anecdotal evidence here, but I am a big believer in max velocity training is one of the reasons why we mitigate the cramps that we see early in season. Whether it's with my football teams, whether it's with my soccer teams, because we know that part of cramping is a neurological issue, because we are just not used to sending and receiving signals that quickly. And so when we go out into competition, we haven't trained at that speed at all yet. We haven't done it in practice. We haven't done it in walkthroughs. We haven't done it in a lot of the things that we do, and especially at that volume. When you see a lot of cramping, especially in football games, you see it in the third and the fourth quarter. You don't see it on the first play of the season. And so one of the things that we do often is we're going to do a lot of max velocity work in the off season and building throughout the middle of the season. And so talking to that coach about how often that we're going to do it, why we're going to do it. The other aspect of it, and the reason why I don't think you can rely on the sport itself, is because you cannot control all the factors. You can't control how they're going to get to max velocity. You can't control how long they're going to hold it. You can't control the rest that they're going to have in between. And so there's too many factors at play there that you don't know what the situation is going to allow. And so you really have to make sure that you are stepping in and still creating and programming opportunities to build this up within their system.
Yeah. I think that's such a good insight just around cramping to begin with, and the general kind of thought process I've had for a long time is your cramping usually is a result of a increase in force output that you haven't been exposed to recently, an increase in the velocity that you're performing a movement at, and a increase in kind of ranges of motion that you're working through. And like you said, in top end speed, there's going to be all three of those happening, where you're getting extreme contractions and hip extension, and so you're really setting yourself up for hamstring and glute kind of cramp action. You have some really intense and very fast hip flexion. And again, so you're setting yourself up for those hip flexors and those adductors, depending on your movement patterning, right? If your hip flexors aren't really great, you're going to be using those adductors to kind of drive that knee through. And the same at that point of ground contact. If you don't have a perfect ground strike, you're going to be using other muscle groups at velocities they're not used to being used at to help stabilize. And you're setting yourself up for those cramps. And I think that's a great thought process on, extra values besides just running fast. Because we talk about that all the time. And I saw just the other day, I wish I could quote who was talking about it, but I found it a bit comical because it was the idea of like the science behind how often you should hit top speed to maintain top speed. And it's similar to how often you should hit really heavy lifts to keep your strength. And the range of it was once every 5 to 8 days, plus or minus 3 days.
So every other day.
Yeah, so I said, in my head, I was like, wait a minute. So that means like every 2 to 11 days could well be. I was like, all right, well, this range is absurd. But the part I took away was to say, all right, there's value in hitting it with some sort of consistency, to maintain it for sure. It's not that you can just go a month or two without doing it and you still keep your speed. There's clearly a drop off within 2 weeks if you haven't touched it. And for you, like Nick, if you're looking at an in-season plan, when we talked about frequency and you were asking about how often I want to train things, what feels kind of ideal for you? What feels right? There's going to be a lot of variables, but as we said for season 4, we're not saying it depends. We're going with answers this season of the Business of Speed podcast. So for you, what kind of feels right?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example of our soccer team that we're working with, because this was the conversation that I was having. This is the team that we're closest with right now. When we are going through our off season, soccer down here in Louisiana begins in October and runs through February. So when we're doing our max velocity work in the off season, and I'm thinking really July, August, September, we are going to introduce this at 4 to 6 reps for the first 3 weeks. And then we're basically going to build 2 reps in until we get to 14 reps on the day. And really that 14 reps is going to get us right up until the beginning of season. We're going to hit that 14 rep mark right at the beginning of September, middle of September, and then we're going to start dropping them by 2 reps every other week, which will basically take us right up to the end of December, beginning of January. And then the beginning of January, we'll do our last max velocity day, which will be 2 of them. And really, there are so many reasons why we're doing this. One of the reasons is obviously what we're talking about now, being able to introduce this to their body, making sure that their conditioning is up. We have 9 guys who will play for 90 minutes. We have 2 guys that will basically play for 60 to 80 minutes. We have 4 guys that will get 10 to 15 minutes. And then we have 4 or 5 guys that won't see any time at all. And so we have to make adjustments from a conditioning standpoint. We have to make adjustments as far as how much max velocity they're getting. Obviously, those guys at the end of the bench, we don't want them dropping down to just 2 reps of max speed work one time per week. That's not going to help them out. And so we're dropping that as we go. But we've talked about this in other episodes as well. We also use this from a readiness standpoint. Every week we're measuring body weight, we're measuring their top max velocity time, we're measuring the number of times that they hit within 5% of their max velocity time. So on those 14 rep days, could you do 11 reps at 95% or better? So there are a lot of pieces that we are measuring here and a lot of reasons why we're measuring it. But those are some of the things that are being taken into account. And like I said, we will take it right up to about a couple of weeks before we get into playoff time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the part that stuck out for me is the idea around that 95% barrier. Like that is our minimum standard. And what we've found over years and years and thousands of reps of flying tens is athletes have to be pretty fatigued out to not be able to hit 95, especially non-track athletes. Like track athletes is a little different because they run faster than most everybody else, and so they sometimes are struggling. But for the majority of my just athletes, 95% of their best fly 10, they can usually hit a lot of those, and they can hit with good regularity. It's very rarely that they are really falling below that 95% barrier. And so with that in mind, you say, like, how many reps is a good amount? For us in the off season, we were a little less on the volume side of it. I mean, we were getting maybe 6 reps at most, and that was like 2 times a week. So 12 reps a week, So for us, it would be like, if you can get 2 to 3 twice a week, you're getting a pretty good exposure to that feeling. And a good guide, I believe, as well, as we talk about how often we're supposed to do something, is if you're doing it regularly enough that it doesn't cause soreness in your athletes. That's a pretty good guideline as well. If you're doing something infrequently and every time you do use it, it causes soreness, you got to readjust it. And it's usually a frequency thing and then the volume within each one of those exposures. It's the same as if you're doing kind of Nordic curls. If you don't do Nordic curls for 4 or 5 days and then try to do Nordic curls again, you're probably going to end up with sore athletes. And you can't afford to have that happen in season. But if you did a set of Nordic curls every day, they probably would stop getting sore from it. If you did 2 sets every 2 days, probably going to stop being sore from it. They're never going to enjoy doing it. But the soreness will go away. And if the soreness is going away, you know that you're not causing a huge deficit for where they're at when they come in as a readiness thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. The one other thing, we touched on this last week, and I'd like to hear, kind of your opinion on this. When you are dealing with sports like basketball, soccer, where the schedule can be all over the place. You could have a competition on a Tuesday, Friday. We've had competitions on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. How do you decide when to incorporate some of that max velocity work? Because that can be the tough part when you're dealing with some of these sports. Football's easy. We got 6 days to recover and to prep them. Football's the easy one. We don't need to worry about that one. But when we talk about all these other sports, how do you decide when is an appropriate time in season to be doing max velocity work and not impact their performance in competition?
That's such a good question. I think it's always the struggle for so many strength coaches that work with a basketball team or a collegiate basketball team, where you just get so nervous and paralyzed by the fear of, if I expose them to this and they tweak something, man, I am done. And kind of rightfully so. Like if you injure one of your guys in season. I would start this answer, though, by saying that if you've done a good job in the off season leading up to the season, you can handle exposures, even though it's not a perfect schedule. If you've not done a good job of incorporating top end speed training throughout the off season and integrating it into the preseason and then integrating it into the season, you're screwed. Like it's not time to talk about how do I do it now. It's now you're talking about how do I do it for next season.
Right.
So with that in mind, like I talked about before, I am in the mindset of always trying to have exposures to top end speed, acceleration, and multi-directional speed every single training session. The volume might be low for each one, but I'm going to try to get exposures each and every time. So, as an example, let's say that we had a competition on a Monday. Tuesday is probably going to be a little bit more of a technical exposure to top end speed, where we're doing maybe some bleed outs, some run outs, so, just like those straight leg shuffles to skips, dribbles to run outs, where they're hitting postures, but I'm not really asking them maybe to hit full speed on those. And then if we're able to train on Wednesday, I'm going to have them run full speed on that day now. If I have had a competition on a Tuesday and then Thursday is our game, and now Wednesday is our only day to train, I'm going to probably try to incorporate maybe one or two of those type of reps where they actually hit something close to 95% of their speed. Still utilizing kind of that bleed out, that run out, just so they're kind of feeling bouncy, gaining that momentum, gaining speed. But I want them to capture a moment where they're actually in those postures running fast. That's where I really believe like those sprint, float, sprint variations, probably underutilized in a lot of sports. But you can get some great posture work, some understandings of relaxation, how to kind of put a little bit more effort into a sprint without changing your form or your technique at all. And those, I think, are great options to kind of throw in those in-between days. When you only have one day. Versus saying, man, I got to hit my fly 10s or my fly 15s. Maybe not the best idea in that moment.
Yeah.
How about for you, Nick, if you're thinking about maybe like a volleyball sport? You guys are working a lot with volleyball.
Yeah.
My situation is that a lot of basketball athletes, usually it's like a Tuesday, Friday game, Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Saturday. How about for volleyball? Because that schedule can get a little bit intense.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that I wanted to add, I agree completely with your answer. And the one thing that I would add to that is similar to the way that we look at training as far as the level of stress that we put on the body. When you talk about programming models and you think about like a Charlie Francis high-low model, we can also look at competitions similarly. There are certain competitions that create greater strain on the body than others. Yeah. And so one thing that I do is we get prepped for the season, especially with like this soccer team that we're working with. We've spent 5 years with them. We know exactly what to expect with a lot of the teams we're going to compete against because we have 5 years of data on who we're playing against, what that coach is like, what style they're going to play, how well we handle that style of competition. And so one of the things that I do is I'll sit down with the schedule and I'll really kind of try to predict the amount of strain that's going to put on the athletes. There are some teams that we play in that are very little strain. They're not a fast team. They're not a physical team. They're not a team that's going to cause us to run a lot. It's more of a ball handling type possession type game. Whereas there are other matches where they are extremely physical, and we know that they're going to spread us, and we know that we are going to have to cover more distance as we go from lane to lane and have to make those adjustments. And so we will often use that piece of data when we're setting up our training schedule, knowing that there are some games that we're going to go into that we are just going to need a recovery day on the next day. Yeah. We are just going to need, and sometimes that's because the game was very physically straining. Sometimes it's because it's a district game and we know that it's going to be psychologically straining. We know that there is going to be a lot of stress going into that day. We know that the fans and the parents on the other side are very rowdy and that they are going to create a lot of animosity. And so there are other aspects that are going into it as well. But yeah, that's one thing that we think about and do at the beginning of the season is really just try and predict what we're walking into. To get back to your question as far as volleyball goes, this is something where a lot of what we're doing is more for the physiological benefit. And so we're not going to see quite the fluctuation in the volume of the max velocity work that we're doing, but it's more of a just kind of micro dosing that throughout the season. Let's get a couple reps, just like you talked about. Let's get a couple reps every day. every day, just like we do some or max height jumping, because we don't get a lot of max height jumping in season. This is a philosophy that's changed for me over my career. When I was in the NBA, we didn't do a lot of plyometrics when we were training in season because there's so much jumping within the sport. And then as I started to look at the sport and look at movement patterns, again, yes, there's jumping, but I'm not in control of the parameters of those jumps, whether it be the intensity of the jump, whether it is a straight vertical jump, whether there's some type of lateral component to it, whether it's single leg, double leg, things like that. And so, in volleyball, we are going to do just a couple of hits of some max velocity work each and every day, again, until we get to about the midpoint in the season. And then we have so much cumulative stress on the body that's one factor that we probably don't need to keep putting in there. Let's go ahead and start to pull back on some of those things and allow the body to start to heal a little bit as we get toward competition time or the playoffs.
Yeah. I think as you were talking, I was even thinking about when you have athletes coming out of competitions in season, as a private coach, you have never really had an off season with kids. They're always coming off of practices and games. So you're already used to kind of handling them coming in less than optimal.
Yeah.
And so it's not a surprise if your team is coming in beat up. And that is where we've worked so hard to say, well, what does our prep look like before we actually get into our sprint work? We do a really intentional job of getting the body prepared to be able to sprint quickly. We're incorporating landings, jumps, different cutting patterns. It's not just a mobility recovery day every single day. That's a different tangent that I've been exploring on my own in my own rants and reflections from coaching. But just the idea of is mobility work actually a bit overrated versus are we requiring mobility work because of bad training plans and over volume for competitions and training? So now our athletes are so beat up that that's all we can offer them is to do some mobility work. Versus if their bodies actually feel better, do they have better range of motion? Do they have better control in positions? But they're so fatigued out, they're under recovered, which is partially on them to be able to sleep, hydrate, and eat better. But I saw this challenge. My philosophies at the end of my time at my facility was, man, we're doing barely any mobility work in our training sessions. Yet our athletes are not getting injured. They're running very fast. They're jumping high. Their bodies are feeling good. They look like they're moving good. Like you're passing every test that is required, except we're not stretching them and actively measuring range of motions. There's always cases like that are different, but just as a general field sport athlete. And so there's always that question of, man, at one point we were spending so much time breathing and doing mobility, and now we're barely doing any of that, yet our athletes having similar injury rates. They're running fast, they're jumping higher, they're setting record boards, getting faster and higher, is it actually as important as it thought it was?
Add that topic to the docket, because I have some extended thoughts and ideas on that as well.
It's in my notes of rants and reflections. So yeah, definitely one to jump into. But I think that's a good kind of baseline around what are these different thoughts around max velocity training, and it's sexy. It gets talked about a lot. People get kind of polarized by it at times, depending on what your philosophy is. But in the end, I think it's coming down to those variables that we talked about. It's an intensity, it's a frequency, and it's a volume thing. If you can control the volume of how many reps you're doing, you can do it more frequent than you think you can. But if in your mind, for it to be valuable, you have to do 6 reps, they all have to be at 98%, then yeah, it's going to be really difficult to find opportunities for exposures in season.
Yes.
And with that idea, it's kind of like, how do we disrupt the status quo for our athletes? As coaches, we're intentionally doing that all the time. Say, well, we're changing this up. The warm-up is sucking, so we're going to play a little game, and we're going to get them out of their natural pattern, or I'm going to change the music. We're always doing things to just get them a little off balance, to help them become adaptable. Oftentimes with the theory of, the game is unpredictable. If the training is too predictable, we're not actually setting them up to have success. But the same thing applies to our staffs, and our own personal lives. In the situation that Nick was sharing at the beginning of the podcast, man, we are disrupting the schedule for our coaches big time. They're
In
used
my
to
sleep.
they're used to working a Friday, going home at what time, and then coming on Saturday, going home at what time, and then having Sunday themselves. And now the disruption for growth, the disruption for learning is, we're not doing that. We're actually going to jump in a car together, drive 6 hours, sleep for 5 hours, get up, consume content, drive another 6 hours, share what we saw, and now come back on Monday in a different space mentally. Nick, what have you seen besides that specific example, as far as just times in the past, maybe unintentionally or intentionally, that you kind of disrupted the status quo with yourself or with your staff as a way to create improvement and growth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can give you two examples, and I hate to keep harping on this because I know that our listeners have heard this several times, but we've talked about our meeting rhythms, and we as a staff have completely changed how we do our meeting rhythms, and the level of energy that everybody has, just because maybe a little bit because it's new, maybe a little bit because there is a lot more ownership being shared, because there is a lot more opportunity for everybody. I think is extremely exciting to think about. But even for myself, I always kind of like the start of a new year. I'm not going to say I'm a big new resolution guy, but I like the thought of newness. I like the thought of, okay, it's time to make an adjustment. It's hard to make an adjustment on August 3rd because it's just some random day. It's hard for it to stick. But when you say, like, okay, this is the beginning. This is the beginning. We're going to make an adjustment. Here's why. Here's how. And so I'm always a little excited for the beginning of the year. I always schedule a couple of days at the end of the year to really reflect on the year prior, to reflect on my goals. Did I achieve them? And then what are my goals for the new year? What are my new systems? What are my new processes? Why am I going after these goals? And so I created disruption within my own schedule every year just to try to create that opportunity for growth, for change, to be challenged. And so, I think that I think I'm kind of on a high in this month of January right now because there's a lot of different changes, both personally in my life, but also professionally within the facility and other things that we're doing. And so, there's been a lot of good disruptions that I think are helping to move us all in the right direction.
Yeah, I love that. One of the challenges, I think it's tough to juggle, especially as a leader, is to say people perform well in routines.
Mm-hmm.
They get a good rhythm for what they're doing, and that's so true. And you don't want to just wildly just destroy all of what's going well.
Yeah.
But as Nick was sharing, I think there's some really simple things you can do that just kind of change up the energy. I'll kind of rattle off a couple of these, but like simple things like reorganizing an office or facility.
Yeah.
Whether you understand feng shui or not, but just it changes up the dynamic. It changes up when you walk through the door. What do you look at versus what do you normally look at? It just changes up. And now there's just this energy around that. Another one can be, as Nick was saying, changing the schedule of your meetings, changing how often you're having meetings, changing the structure within the meeting. There's sometimes, I've shared this in the past, where it was every meeting was, we're going to start off with, give me a win. All right, well, that gets old after a while when you just have the exact same structure. Not to throw everything out, but just to say, what can I do a little differently? How about changing where you have the meeting at? Think about going to school, and every now and then when you would go outside for that hour, man, that just sparked something inside of people. It just changed up everything that was going on. If we have our meeting always in the office with the door shut, the same lighting, the same walls, the same board, what if we go out on the turf and just sit and do a circle up? What if we're meeting in the weight room today? What if we're just going to go outside in the parking lot and get some air and some sunshine? Like, these are such simple things. Going to another level too is just saying, what if we just change the colors around something? You know, not our brand colors, obviously, but just say the office. The office has been white for years. Okay, we're going to come in. Now it's going to be some shade of blue. You know, it's a shade of green now intentionally. We're doing this is going to be red now. And we're just changing up that visual stimulus. Bigger changes, reorganizing who's coaching what, who's leading what. You know, not firing anybody, although that is going to be the next level of this, but just saying, you know, like Nick has been coaching this group, and this group, but today, for this week, I just want to switch it up, and Steve's going to coach those. Nick's going to coach the other ones. I want you guys to kind of compare notes on it at the end of the week. We'll go back to normal next week. But we're just changing it up for this week, just to kind of change up the rhythm. And then, yeah, sometimes it requires promoting somebody, demoting somebody, letting somebody go, bringing in somebody new. Nick has talked about that in the past when he's talked about just some of the hiring situations that have gone on. And I know that I experienced that too. Nothing creates brand new energy around a facility, a business, a team, as when somebody that wasn't really pulling their weight and not bringing a lot of value is gone, and you insert with somebody new who's got tons of enthusiasm. Nothing can replicate that. And so if your business is getting stagnant, if you're not seeing the growth you want, it's worth investigating that to look at, man, they're great, but I just don't think they're really where they should be for their career, for us. And we're going to encourage them to move in a different direction so we can bring in new energy. And that might be the change that takes you guys to twice the growth next year. But just getting everybody's minds going about what does that look like when you create change intentionally. It's not out of control. You're kind of controlling it and manipulating it, but you're staying connected with your team along the way. You know, you're not just randomly coming in on Monday and saying, hey, guess what? You're not coaching that stuff anymore. They're coaching it. You're bringing them in to say, this is why we're doing that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is just the great mark of a good coach, of a good leader, of a good manager. You know, as you talked about, even us as strength coaches, we've got to be able to do this within our own weight room. But the mark of a great one is knowing when the time to do this is, because you don't want to wait so long that things have become so stagnant that when you make that change, everybody's kind of like, what's going on here? What's wrong? Why now? And you don't want to do it when you're on a great roll and everybody is really hitting their stride, and then you throw them off and they got to make another adjustment. It's you know, trying to find that time that it's like, okay, right after we've made the stride, right where we need just another little edge, you know, just a little bit more. And so, I think that is where as leaders we are trying to really find the best opportunity to do that, to not hinder performance, but also to do it at a time that just continues to help push us forward.
There you go. I love that. Start subtle. Don't go for the big change on the first try. Something simple. Change up the environment, change up the rhythm of something before you end up hiring new personnel or letting personnel go. But Nick, I appreciate you guys sharing. We're looking forward to the updates on how the clinic went. Big takeaways. I know a fun thing for us always on the podcast is breaking down some of those clinics we attend. Yeah. Sharing what we heard, how we experienced it, what's the application going forward. And for all of our listeners, we appreciate you guys. Check out as we're posting more content related to this podcast, and questions that you're having really drives what we're bringing value-wise.